Hello, this is a bit of a ramble into the world of polytheist epistemology, um, partly based off a little discussion that was had, half-hour discussion that was had a few nights ago with a group of friends. I say a discussion, it was mostly me waffling at them and then asking questions at the end. But this is kind of building on that, recapping some of it for the benefit of any listeners who weren't participating in that original discussion, and expanding on it in various different directions. We have to start, of course, by addressing the question of what is epistemology in the first place, and then how that fits in with polytheism. So epistemology is the school of philosophy that looks at how we know what we believe we know, or we think we know. So that sounds very abstract if you're not familiar with these regions of philosophical discussion. So let's take an example. I'm sitting in my dining room and I can see through the window into the garden, and there is an apple tree there. I know there is an apple tree in my garden. So the epistemological question, which somebody might ask, well, imagine there's an imaginary person sitting here asking me these questions, is, well, how do you know there's an apple tree in the garden? What methods do I have to know that there is an apple tree in that garden? And there's a variety of answers I can give to that. And some of these answers will sort of weave in and out of all sorts of different philosophical ideas and concepts, including some ideas from Carl Jung, and the idea of the various types of personalities, which can also be related to forms of epistemology. But before we get onto that, although this does sort of overlap with this, how do I know there is that apple tree in my garden? Well, I can go out into my garden and I can use my various bodily senses. I can touch the tree, I can feel its bark and its leaves under my fingers. I can hear the rustle of the wind in the leaves and the creak of the branches as the wind moves them. I can smell the aroma of, well, I was going to say the blossom. This is the wrong time of year for smelling blossom, but you get the gist. I can see it visually. I can see it. If I were so disposed to want to lick an apple tree and find out what an apple tree tastes like, I could do that. I don't think I really want to, but I could go and lick the apple tree. So I could engage with my various bodily senses and say, this thing that I am hearing, smelling, touching, seeing, etc., is an apple tree. That is enough for me to know that there is an apple tree. I don't require any greater evidence than that. But somebody else might. Somebody else might say, well, have you ever thought you had seen something, only later on to realise that you had not seen the thing you thought you had seen, that you were mistaken in that? And just like everybody else on this planet, naturally enough, I've had instances in my life where I thought I've heard someone, or I thought I've seen something, or what have you, and I've been mistaken. So I know that my five senses, particularly, as you notice, I wear glasses, my eyesight isn't absolutely fantastic, so occasionally my senses are mistaken and I misread one set of sensory impressions for another. I have seen something, but it's not what I think I see, or I've heard something, but it's not who I thought I'd heard. So there is sensory input there, but I've misinterpreted it. So I know my senses are open to misinterpretation. I've never drunk quite enough gin to start seeing pink elephants dance around the room, but there are plenty enough documented cases of people in the world who have consumed vast quantities of alcohol or chewed magic mushrooms or engaged in various other substances where they have started to see things and hear things that absolutely nobody else could see and hear, and that are then labelled as hallucinations. So could I be hallucinating that apple tree in my garden? Well, potentially I might be. Therefore, how do I know that my senses, my physical sensations, are a reliable guide to knowledge? Well, on this occasion, I have the added benefit of memory, in that I can remember hundreds of occasions I've lived in this house for years and years and years, probably thousands of occasions actually, when I've been outside and I've seen the tree and heard the tree and touched the tree and all the rest of it. So it's not just today's sensory impressions, which are perhaps a very transitory thing, but it is backed up by the memory of many, many previous occasions. So if I were in somebody else's house for the very first time and seeing the trees and plants in their garden for the very first time, you could say, well, first impressions, how do you know that you're not hallucinating, that really is there? Because I wouldn't have the backup of memory, never having been to that place before. But on this occasion, I have both the sensations of the moment and my memories of sensations in the past. So that's an added layer. So the memory plus the present day sensations. And I could, of course, go and drag somebody in off the streets and say, can you see an apple tree in my garden? And they will either say yes or no. And if everyone I drag in to the garden says, yes, there is an apple tree there, then that verification from other people backs up what I am experiencing. I might, of course, find somebody who says, no, there's absolutely no apple tree there, you fruitcake, there's nothing there at all. Whereupon, does that undermine all of the other people who've said, yes, there is? Or do I start to suspect that this person is just having a bit of a laugh and a wind-up and they really can see the tree and they're just pretending they can't? So that there comes in multiple levels of experience here. So not only do I have my own immediate experience, but I can turn to other people and ask them for verification, for backup of what I am experiencing, or indeed to disagree and say, no, I think you're imagining that because I can't see the thing that they can see. And as per the person who says, no, there's no apple tree there, just because they say they can, or indeed because they say they can't, how do I know they're telling the truth? So that's an added level of factor to consider within epistemology. That just as I might be mistaken in how I interpret the data coming in through my eyes and my ears and my nose and everywhere else, and I know that I am capable of misinterpreting sensory input, so other people might be capable of misinterpreting, well, might be, clearly are capable of misinterpreting sensory input, or indeed just lying by claiming to sense something they can't sense, or pretending they can't sense something which in fact they can sense. So mere statement of backup or statement of disagreement isn't necessarily enough in and of itself to provide a definite, reliable epistemology, because of this question of people either being mistaken or lying. But it's certainly something which every single one of us factors in on a daily basis, that we tend to assume that when we see something or hear something or experience something, the other people around us will be seeing it or hearing it too. We may just take it for granted. We may not ask them or double check with them, can you see that dog walking down the street? We may just automatically assume they can do. But there will be perhaps occasions when they don't, and they challenge us, or something arises in conversation where it makes it clear that what we are experiencing isn't what they are experiencing. And we may have to account for that by different routes. Is the fault in me? Am I imagining it? Is it in them? Are they just really short-sighted and can't see what I can see? There could be all sorts of reasons why my sensory input, why my grasp of what I'm experiencing is different from their grasp of what they're experiencing. So it's not, in other words, what I'm trying to say with all of this waffle is that it's an epistemology through my own senses, and epistemology by the verification of other people's senses isn't 100% ever. But on a day-to-day basis, it's pretty bloody good, and it's what most of us rely on most of the time. There are other examples we'll get to as we go along. So where does this key in, you may well ask, to polytheism? And I'm saying polytheism here rather than paganism, because paganism is such a broad term. It can include so many different things that it would make the conversation really confusing, I think, to try and include every possible permutation on that. Whereas polytheism, if we take it as the basic explanation, interpretation of the word, a belief in many gods, goddesses, deities, beings, call them what you will, take that as a starting point. It opens up an interesting can of worms. Christianity, Islam, Judaism have a long documented history of philosophical, theological discussions between all sorts of people over the centuries, which includes lots of debates on epistemology. I dare say if we were to jump in the TARDIS and go back to ancient Greece or Rome or Egypt, we'd find lots of people with very long beards having all sorts of philosophical discussions about these issues too, but sadly very little of it was written down. And so we often have big gaps in our understanding of how polytheists approach issues, which are the kinds of issues that are well documented within monotheism. So this, and anyway, even if we did have a fair account, an account of what people thought 2,000 odd years ago doesn't necessarily reflect experience in the 21st century. So this is kind of, shall we say, not only maybe starting in a very small way to fill in gaps, but also to think about how the modern experience updates, changes, and is perhaps possibly in some ways different from experiences of people in previous centuries or previous millennia about these things. Within the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, there are others of course in the world as well, Sikhism and so on, there is frequently, because you've got a notion of one God, there is often a notion of one truth. And so the search for a singular truth becomes a defining lens through which people approach their notion of what truth is. And epistemology, the search for knowledge, is ultimately a search for truth. Because at one level you could say discussions about whether or not there is an apple tree or what colour the wallpaper is, they're all search for knowledge. Knowing the colour of the wallpaper, knowing what trees are in the garden is knowledge. It's not really truth with a capital T in some grandiloquent way, some huge metaphysical way, but you've got to start somewhere. And so, at least within a religious context, you might start by discussing small-scale things and how we know what plants are in the garden or what colour the wallpaper is. But ultimately where it is leading to are the bigger questions. How do we know what we think we know about the divine or about the afterlife, or about questions of what is good and what is evil and all these other kind of big, huge issues that have kept theologians in work for millennia. And speaking of keeping theologians in work, we'll shift here to a quote from a theologian, Christian saint in this case, St. Thomas, who said, "Things known are in the knower according to the mode of the knower," which is not the easiest sentence to get your head around. It's lots of knows and knowers and a slightly convoluted idea, but one of the reasons why I'm quoting that is because I want to relate it to Jungian ideas. Carl Jung, not a pagan, not so far as I know anyway, built upon ancient Greek ideas that had been prevalent throughout medieval Europe and other parts of the world as well. That there were the four elements, earth, air, fire and water to the Greeks, but Jung said, put the discussions around elementalism to one side. What there are four types of people, four modes of consciousness, which relate to the earth, air, fire, water ideas of the ancient Greeks, going all the way back to a philosopher called Empedocles. He didn't use the term earth, air, fire and water when discussing the personality types. He said there are the sensation type, the thinking type, the feeling type, and the intuitive type, which are based upon the old Greek ideas. And we can say each type, linking this into St. Thomas's quote, is a mode of knowing. So how does information get into your head? How do notions of what is real and what's not real, what's true, what's not true, how do we structure them in our minds? There is at least four different ways from a Jungian point of view of structuring knowledge. And the stuff I've just been saying about going out there into my garden, listening and touching and smelling and tasting and so forth with the tree, fits into what Jung referred to as the sensation type, which is based upon the old Greek ideas of earth, the body, the physicality. So he said there are people in the world who are very centered in their bodies, very practical people, very commonsensical people, very kind of logical, ordered people. They're very very good organisers, very good at, if you want to plan an expedition somewhere or plan a holiday, one of these sensation type people is ideal to turn to, because they're very focused and practical and on the ball and very organised, and they're very good at engaging in the world. They have all those sorts of personality traits to go with them. And they tend to be the kinds of people who believe in what they can see and hear and taste and touch, and are very sceptical about anything they can't hear and see and taste and touch. It's a different personality type, deals with those more kind of metaphysical things. And so it's that sort of very pragmatist approach to life. If you can see it and touch it and taste it, it's real, and if you can't, it probably isn't, so why bother wasting time talking about it? And you could say that's the bedrock of an awful lot of science and scientific approaches to knowledge. And the whole scientific method isn't of itself a form of epistemology, it's a way of knowing. You don't have to be, if you're of the sensation personality type, doesn't automatically mean you become a scientist. But it's that sort of mindset that's very, very centered in reality, if you like, in a physical reality at any rate. So how do we go about knowing things? Touching, tasting, feeling. Well, that's all well and good. That applies to absolutely everyone. Christian, Muslim, atheist, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever. How do we link that specifically into polytheism? Polytheism, just said, is the belief in many gods and goddesses, and in the vast majority of forms of polytheism, you'll also find a raft of other spirits and entities alongside gods and goddesses, sort of smaller scale, if you like, spirits. And for me personally, I don't see a great deal of difference between animism and polytheism, except in the size of the deities or the size of the spirits in question. So an animist, or polytheist indeed, might well, as well, alongside gods and goddesses, believe in ancestral spirits, granddad and great-great Uncle Fred and everybody else who's died and passed over but still hovers around, having an influence on the land of the living. They might believe in animal spirits, they might believe in spiritual entities that live in the mountainsides and the forests and on the shore of the ocean. They might believe in a whole raft of other peculiar things. So a polytheist question, just one of many that we could ask, is how do we know what we know? So somebody says, there's spirits living in the forest, tree spirits. There are dryads living in the trees in the forest, and they talk to each other, and sometimes when I go for a walk in the woods, they talk to me. Okay, so the question then becomes, well, how do you know that? How do you know that there are spirits in the woods scampering around talking to each other? And someone of the sensation type personality, well, possibly wouldn't believe there are spirits in the wood to start with. But if they did, they'd be thinking of it in terms of what they've seen, what they've heard, what they've felt, maybe touching them. A spirit touched me as I walked through the woods. What they've smelt. They may be experiencing these things in a way that is difficult to get verification from other people. So perhaps if there were two people walking through the woods, and one of them saw something walking, some mysterious entity walking further on in the forest, maybe the person they're walking with hasn't seen it. And so there is not the backup from somebody else's senses. But the interest there, if you like, in the kind of the method for trying to verify why I think this thing is true, why I think this experience is reliable, and not simply delusional or hallucinatory or misinterpreted, or any one of a dozen other possible ways of discrediting that experience. That peculiar light I can see up ahead in the forest path is a dryad and not one of a dozen other things that it might be. How do I know that? Well, the sensation type might say, well, I experienced it, I saw it, I felt it. And even if they can't necessarily back it up with anybody else's sensations, who has been with them or at least gone into that woods on another occasion, then maybe they can back it up through their own repeated experience to say, well, I've been in the woods 5 times and on 3 of those occasions I've seen this weird light, so this weird light is definitely there. Or I've heard voices, or I've, whatever it is that they've experienced. So their own kind of repetition of experience becomes a bit like my memory of having seen that same apple tree on hundreds of other occasions in the past. The consistency of the experience, even if I cannot back it up by turning to somebody else and saying, have you seen it too, necessarily, at least the internal consistency might be sufficient for at least some people, clearly not everyone, but for some people to say, yes, I feel that this experience I have is a valid experience, a plausible experience, a real experience, and not simply a one-off brain fluctuation in which I have misunderstood, misinterpreted, hallucinated, or in some other way had a misleading experience. If someone can turn to another person and say, have you been in that woods too, and if so, have you had a weird experience, and that other person says, yes, I have, then that poses some interesting questions in and of itself. How many other people have to share an experience for it to gain traction, to gain plausibility as a, yes, this probably has happened, rather than this is a delusion or a misinterpretation? And I can't obviously give you a nice, neat number. I can't say, well, the answer is 36. Scale and the number of people sharing an experience at different points in history, depending on the nature of the experience, has been turned to and sometimes given a lot of weight and credit, and other times less so. And you could argue that partly it depends on the willingness of the wider world to want to credit certain forms of experience as being real. So with experiences of a religious nature, a mystical nature, people having visionary experiences, there's occasions where large numbers of individuals at the same time, rather than on repeated separate occasions, but large numbers of people at the same time, have experienced something which they have all described as an angel or as a vision of the Virgin Mary or whatever it may be on that occasion. And again, this kind of, in and of itself, begs, if 5 people all say they saw a duck on the village green, you credit that's pretty, yes, that was a duck on the village green. But then ducks have a degree of plausibility, because most of us have seen ducks and heard ducks and occasionally eaten a duck, to know that ducks exist in a way that conjecture about the existence of angels and pixies in the woods and the Virgin Mary doesn't necessarily have the same weight of plausibility that the existence of ducks has. If 20 people all say they have seen the Virgin Mary hovering in the air, does that make it more plausible than if it's only one person who has seen the Virgin Mary? What if it's 200 people or 1,000 people? As the number exponentially grows, does that add to credibility? Well, if you already believe in the Virgin Mary anyway, then the answer is probably yes. If you are deeply skeptical and sort of born-again atheist who doesn't believe in any of it, then even if 1 million people say they have seen exactly the same thing, that is not likely to gain weight or traction in the mind of the person who doesn't wish to believe a thing to be true, who is looking for reasons not to believe, as opposed to someone who's looking for reasons to believe. And this in and of itself, you could argue, is a central feature of epistemology, not just within a polytheist context, but within just about any other context, in that what we choose to give credit to as this evidence is weighty, this evidence is nonsense, is to a heavy extent filtered by our own pre-existing baggage, our cultural upbringing, our biases, our wants and likes and dislikes and hopes and fears and all the rest of it. To an extent, you could say we have a wish to believe certain things and a wish not to believe other things, depending on our background and upbringing as to what those things are. And so evidence that may utterly convince Joe Bloggs may totally fail to convince Fred Bloggs. Depends on the background. What about repeated experience? Again, like me going into the garden and seeing the same tree on 1,000 occasions. Let's say 10,000 people have seen the Virgin Mary, but not all at the same time. So that could be, some of them were in pairs, some of them were threes, some of them were all by themselves, and it's on different days and different years, it's spread out over a passage of time. You've got 10,000 people all over the place who all say they've seen the Virgin Mary, rather than 10,000 people all gathered together at one time in one place, all seeing the Virgin Mary on that occasion. Does one have a greater weight than the other? So if it's all at the same time, does that have more weight or less weight than lots of divergent people in different places all having what they believe to be the same experience? Within a pagan context, at least a modern pagan context, over the last 10, 20 years or whatever it's been, a phrase that's come into common parlance is UPG, unsubstantiated personal gnosis. So somebody having a dream, a vision, in a meditative state, some idea flashes into their head, having some kind of experience that is peculiar to them. They were the only person at that moment in that place having that experience. And it's unsubstantiated because they haven't yet backed it up with anything else. But sometimes there can be a degree of verification in which, let's say, I have a dream about Thor, the god of thunder and lightning within Norse mythology, and Thor says something to me in my dream, and a month later I'm chatting to someone on the bus, and they casually disclose to me that they have had a dream about Thor, who has said to them exactly the same thing that Thor said to me in my dream. Does that start to accrue a degree of weight where the same mystical experience has been had by two unrelated people? Particularly when I haven't elucidated the information by prompting it. So you could say, if I went up to somebody and said, I had this dream, and this is what was said to me, have you ever had a dream like that? They could say yes, purely to make me happy. Not because they actually have, but they're just kind of patting me on the head and saying, yes dear, of course I have. Therefore that would lack substance. But if they spontaneously offer this information without me having put the information in their head in the first place, the same thing is coming from two sources. What if it comes from 5 sources, 100 sources, 1,000 sources? At what point does it acquire weighty credence that the same thing is being experienced by lots of different people who have no relationship to each other, so it's difficult to account for some kind of domino effect of one person somehow sparks off the experience in another person. Maybe this experience is at different times and in different places and is hard to account for in any other way. At what point does it acquire weight? Does it acquire epistemological validity that we start to think this is more than just one weird person having a dream? This is something consistent. And from a polytheist perspective, you could well argue that a lot of the entities we talk about, whether it's gods or ancestors or nature spirits or call them what you will, other things, how do we understand what they are? How do we get a sense of what they are? Well, a lot of this is tradition handed down. We don't really know where the stories of Zeus or Thor or Hecate or Isis or anyone else come from. There may be some authors we know, like Hesiod and Homer and so on, who have written stories down, but they are presented as stories which they themselves did not make up, but which they heard growing up in their cultures, and they just put pen to paper. So it's not that they made the story up, rather they received it from someone else, who presumably got it from someone else and someone else and someone else. And so what we don't have is the kind of scriptural validity that quite a lot of other religions have. So a lot of religions have a scripture that was written by either a named person, Mark, Matthew, Luke and John, for example, or even if not by a named person, can at least be pinpointed down to a particular period of time. It was written sometime in this century, somewhere in that part of the world. And so it's narrowed down to a particular time or a particular place, and is presented to somebody saying, well, I heard so-and-so person say this, and I'm going to write down their sermon. I'm going to write down what they preached when they were in this place on this occasion. And it's as close as we get to a kind of first-hand account, perhaps. So somebody who's saying, well, what were Jesus's views on so-and-so issue? What were Muhammad's views on so-and-so issue? Somebody might be able to point to a book and say, well, in this book, in this scripture, it says here that his views on that issue were blah, 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 and we can read it there. Now, you could say there is a bit of a take it on trust element, in that we've got to assume, I say we've got to, people who subscribe to the text, to the sacred text in question, have got to assume that whoever it was holding that quill, scribbling down the words of Muhammad or scribbling down the words of Jesus or whoever it happens to be, was scribbling them down accurately. They weren't half remembering them or making them up entirely or getting confused about what was said because they were stood right at the back of the crowd and couldn't quite hear what was being said at the front of the crowd. There is a degree of trust involved that the amanuensis holding the pen and writing it down did so accurately. But that's even with that element of trust, there's a much more specific source for that information than the notion of stories about Zeus, stories about Jupiter, stories about Khnum or whoever, in which we can't pin them down easily to one person or one period of time because they've become traditional stories passed down and passed down and passed down through so many people that they have acquired cultural validity but are not more easily pin downable than that, if you pin down by is a weird word. It may well be the case that if it's a story about Apollo, for argument's sake, I say the involvement of Apollo in the story of Midas and the music contest, when did that story first come about? How did that story first come about? Was it the case that there was a particular person who had this really vivid dream, when she woke up in the morning, she told it to somebody else, who told it to somebody else, who told it to somebody else, and round and round and round and round and round it went, until eventually it gets written down on parchment, and via that parchment transmits itself into the 21st century. So did it start, that story, with one person? And if it did, was it a dream? Or was it some sort of mystical visionary experience where maybe they were meditating in a temple and they went into a deep trance and suddenly all of this imagery came into their mind and they came out of their trance and they immediately announced to the audience what they had experienced? Or were they chewing a mushroom in the woods and then came back and told people about what they'd experienced whilst they were off their face on mushrooms? Quite how did it start? We've got no context for those sorts of stories within pretty much all forms of polytheism, lack that kind of rooted context where we can say this is who gave us this story and this is how they acquired this story or how they experienced it or how it made its way to paper in the first place and it is now being consumed by us today, 21st century, this great period of time onwards. Which begs the question, how do we know what we think we know about Apollo, or about Zeus, or about any one of 1,000 other deities and beings within the various different polytheist pantheons? Is it because we have read it in a source and we take that source on trust as being something more reliable than a children's bedtime story that somebody just made up on the spot to put their kids to sleep? They thought, oh God, shut up, go to sleep, kid. And so they make up some story about Apollo and a music contest, and there you go. It's got no meaning or significance or weight deeper to it than a parent trying to put a kid to sleep at bedtime. We assume there is more to it than that, but we don't know that. But we like to think there is more to it than that. How would a deity convey itself to human worshippers, followers, whatever word you want to use? Perhaps through vision, perhaps through the voice of Charlton Heston booming out of some burning shrubbery, perhaps in a dream, perhaps in all sorts of other ways. And if it was in a dream, does that give it more credence than if it was the result of chewing a mushroom in the woods? Are some forms of visionary experience more credible as sources of information than other forms of visionary experience? And is the nature of the person having the vessel, if you will, of the visionary experience in any way impactful upon the quality of epistemology? So, for example, Joseph Smith, the sort of founding father of the Mormon movement, went off and had his visionary experiences of the angel Moroni coming down with emerald tablets, and then having to look through a stone with a hole in it to be able to decipher these emerald tablets, and sit in his cave writing it all down. Before the angel Moroni whipped the emerald tablets quite conveniently back up to the world beyond. He was about 17-ish, give or take, when he had those experiences. Had he been 85 with a beard down to his kneecaps, would that give the vision more credence or credibility than some spotty 17-year-old in a cave having visions of angels and writing down things from emerald tablets? If some 17-year-old ran up to me in the street and said, I've had a vision and it's this, would I sit there and go, ooh, and devote my life to it? Or would I think, yeah, that's nice, dear. There are teenagers these days who kind of have tremendous followings, in Greta Thunberg and people like that, who, not that she has visionary experiences, but who's very young and has an awful lot of people hanging on her words. So what to me seems like a somewhat dubious story of a teenager in a cave talking to angels, if it happened again today, maybe there would be vast numbers of people who would say, yep, just because they're young doesn't mean they don't know what they're on about. And equally, you might say just because they're old and got a beard down to their kneecaps doesn't guarantee that they know what they're on about. So should it matter who received the experience in the first place? Whether they're young or middle-aged or old, male or female, rich or poor, educated or uneducated, any of these factors that might give credence in the way that if somebody comes up to you and tells your story, to an extent, well, I say to you, so they tell you something bizarre and unusual that has happened to them. Are we more, or are you more, inclined to give credence to their account if they're a certain type of person, and much less credence to their account if they're a different type of a person? Whether that's down to age or social class or levels of education, or whether they look stable or whether they look a bit disturbed, or all sorts of other factors that might come into play. So there's, again, the epistemology is not just of the information itself, but sometimes also of the person conveying the information, the vessel for the information in and of it as it comes to you. Talked about the sensation type. We'll mention the other 3 types within the Jungian context, and then move on to a few other issues. I'll try and talk a bit faster. As well as the sensation type, who takes in things through the senses of the body and tends to trust what their body tells them and what they see and hear and taste and so on. The thinking type of consciousness is the very kind of logical, rational, intellectual sort of person. Someone who would probably make a great scientist or a great barrister, someone whose mind thinks very clearly, very rationally, very dispassionately, very uninfluenced by emotion, very objective and able to take a step back, and who can argue something out because the chain of argument makes sense and has internal logic to it. So that they're not necessarily as reliant on the senses and the experiences of the body as they are upon their own intellect, and the degree to which a chain of arguments, of ideas, logically fits together one after the other, that these ideas hold water. And so we might look to intellectual arguments for why we believe what we believe, why we or don't believe what we don't believe, for that matter. As something is presented to us, a claim, a statement, whether that's about the existence of a spirit, or whether somebody says, oh, I can heal diseases by laying on my hands and chanting. Do we believe them? Do we not believe them? Well, all of these sorts of claims that are subject to epistemological assessment as to whether they are plausible claims, believable claims. You could argue for their thinking function, the person is placing that claim in a wider context of ideas, of concepts, of philosophies, of past research, past experience, their own and other people's that they've read or learned about in some capacity. And does this claim fit in well with other claims made, or does it seem glaringly contradictory to other claims made? Is there evidence for it? Has there been research for it? Has it been analysed and assessed? And you don't necessarily have to go down a scientific method to fit in with the thinking function that Jung describes, but that whole scientific method that you test something and then you retest it and you retest it and see if you get the same results each time, and then you try and control for variables because it might be some factor you've not thought of yet that's influencing the outcome, so you try and regulate for that. Those sorts of thought processes are very much part and parcel of what Jung is describing as that thinking style of mind. So how might that pan out in the polytheist world, and various other worlds as well, actually? Well, let's go for that claim about laying on of hands and curing diseases. So somebody might say, well, I can do this. And the thinking personality might say, well, okay, maybe you can, maybe you can't. Let's try it again. Find a different person with a different illness, and you do your laying on of hands and chant and this and that, and let's see if it happens again. And then a third time and a fourth time and a fifth time. And meanwhile, let's look at other factors, what might be going on here. So on the occasions when it fails, that's not an automatic disapproval, but it may be that there is a factor here we haven't taken into account. Why these 4 people recovered and that one person didn't recover? Is it because there are different illnesses, and maybe the chant that works for those 4 illnesses doesn't work for that illness? Is it this, is it that, is it the other time of the moon, or any one of a million different things you could think of? So there would be a wish to experiment, to not just believe everything at first statement, but to explore, to examine, to consider other possible causative factors, to see if the experience could be repeated, and repeated under different conditions. And after a while, maybe that would, the claim of healing powers might be taken seriously, or the claim of pixies in the woods might be taken seriously after repetition and experiment and so on and so forth, to gain a sense of, is this actually happening, or are there other possible explanations that account for this more clearly, more accurately? And the other explanations look to are going to be things that are influenced and affected by that individual's upbringing and cultural backgrounds as to what kinds of areas they would tend to look to for potential other explanations for bizarre phenomena or unusual claims. And even indeed what is considered a bizarre phenomenon or an unusual claim in the first place. Because what might sound very bizarre to someone in 4th century Athens might seem quite humdrum and conventional to somebody in 19th century Zaire. So things change from culture to culture, period of history to period of history, as to what you would ask questions of and what you just take for granted as, yes, that's true. Because it would seem plausible, it would seem logical, it would seem just normal, really, for lack of a better word, in that culture, in that period of time, even though it might not seem normal to somebody else from a very different culture or a very different period of time, where different questions might be asked. The feeling function is another one of Jung's propositions, and which sits in, to an extent, in opposition to the thinking function, in that the feeling function person tends to be very, very emotional. Quick to laugh, quick to cry, very strong, intense emotions, loves quickly, hates quickly, very caring and nurturing, but also potentially very smothering and suffocating, depending on how well balanced they are. So whereas the thinking person is very kind of rational and calculating and slightly like a Vulcan of Star Trek, the emotion function, the feeling function rather, is intensely emotional, quite the opposite. And so the argument there might be more in terms of what feels right rather than what follows a logical chain of thought. And so feeling comes into it. Does this feel as if it's true? When this person tells me they have healing powers, do I feel that they have healing powers? Do I feel a healing vibe coming off them? Or do I feel that they're just lying through their back teeth or delusional or whatever? And that kind of gut reaction very much comes into it as to what's taken to be true and what's taken with a pinch of salt in terms of claims made. But it can also be in terms of what we have a predilection to believe in the first place. So, for example, let's take something like, was there once upon a time a matriarchal society? Well, in 10, 15,000 years ago, did humanity exist in a matriarchal society or a whole set of matriarchal societies? Or has society always been patriarchal, or a mixture and a match according to different parts of the world, different periods of history? Someone who has a strong emotional investment in feminism and wanting to feel that women were figures of admiration and they were goddesses and priestesses and seeing all of that in a very positive light might feel very strongly that there ought to have been a matriarchal period of history, and therefore there must have been. Whereas somebody else who is very sceptical and very doubtful, or completely neutral and indifferent, and says, well, what is the evidence? Show me some evidence of a matriarchal society. It's not because they're very against it or very for it, they're just looking for material evidence. What would that evidence be? Well, that evidence might be statues and carvings, it might be accounts of the Amazons written in ancient texts, it might be descriptions of this, descriptions of that. Whereas, let's say, somebody coming at it from a very feeling sensation function might be much more influenced by dreams, by ideals, by, well, human nature is like this, therefore it must have gone this way. Because we can see that mothers are very powerful and very influential in their lives of their children, therefore it's natural that society would once have revered mothers, and the role of men in fatherhood, because of the distances of time involved between sex and then giving birth, might be less obvious in certain cultures. They might not have twigged the relationship or seen it as important. So there might be all sorts of other arguments argued from other points of view in other directions as to what is taken as credible, as good epistemology, and what is seen as unreliable or flaky or implausible epistemology. And the final function to mention briefly here is the intuitive one, which stands in contrast to the sensation one, for the person who's intensely imaginative, who can leap to insights without having a clue how they got there, because their mind takes in a lot and works very speedily and kind of goes from A to Z very, very rapidly without conscious awareness of how they're getting from A to Z. So they can tell you the answer is Z, but without having a clue why it's Z. So they would find a hard time breaking it down into the chain of thought that's led them to that end result. They just go straight to the end result. And it also tends to be so imaginative, so kind of taken with ideas and inspirational concepts and forces that belief in deities, belief in angels and ancestors and fairies at the bottom of the garden is all part and parcel of the course that's gone with, rather than seen as something that needs material proof. So seeing that glowing light in the woods is in and of itself proof that there is something strange there. Not necessarily proof of precisely what that something strange is. Is it a fairy? Is it a garden gnome? Is it a will-o'-the-wisp? Is it this? Is it that? Is it the other? That might need a little bit more clarification, but enough to take it in and of itself that this is something weird, rather than the result of having had a few too many pints, or needing a new pair of glasses, or being under a lot of nervous strain, or any of the other kind of more rationalist dismissals of what that weird light in the woods is. And so in terms of like the dreams of Thor, and Thor saying something profound in the dreams, the intuitive personality would take that as much more reliable as a form of evidence that, yes, this one person has had this experience, therefore we must give weight to it. And if we find a second, a third, a fourth people who have also had similar visionary experiences, that just kind of piles on the plausibility of this experience as to what Thor is telling the world, or what Thor is revealing about his own profound divine nature, or what have you. I'm just realising this is talking a lot longer than I was planning to talk for, and I still haven't touched on half of what I wanted to touch on. Might have to do this in several sections. Make a brief detour into French philosophy and actually sociology with Jean-Francois Lyotard. Not a polytheist nor a pagan, but he did use the term polytheism of values, except he said it in French. And it both does not and does, I'm going to be awkward here, mean polytheism in the sense that I'm using it. Doesn't. The notion of values, as Lyotard is using it, is that we have, well, all of us, whatever religion or no religion we are, we all have sets of values, things that motivate us, concern us, money, truth, justice, fairness, compassion, love, adventure, all sorts of these big buzzwords that motivate us and are our core driving values. Societies have them. Lyotard was a sociologist, so he was not only thinking of individual people, he was thinking of mass movements. And I suppose the obvious ones we've just touched on there of this in American society, truth, justice, and the American way, as motivating values. Now, you can argue the toss as to how many people live up to them and so on in reality, but as conceptual values, they are big issues in American culture. And maybe we could come up with a set for France, and a set for China, a set for Indonesia, and a set for all sorts of other countries as to what their motivating values are. These values, from Lyotard's view, and not just him, quite a few other people have said something quite similar over the years, are like gods in a sense. They are the gods of the culture, not in the sense of going to church and praying to them, but they are the vast forces. Jung would certainly think in terms of archetypal forces in the unconscious that drive a society or a group within the society, like a church or a mosque or a political party or perhaps a big business corporation or something. The big sort of motivating drivers and forces that get people out their house, in the same way that within a religion, what gets somebody to go to church on a Sunday, or if they're polytheistic, what gets them out dancing in the woods every full moon? for those who do. I appreciate not all polytheists do. What gets them out doing these things, sacrificing their time, not watching their favourite TV show, going out when it's a bit rainy or a bit unpleasant, but then they go out anyway and they do it because it's right, and it drives them, and it gets them to make sacrifices of their time, their energy, maybe they're spending money buying stuff that they otherwise wouldn't spend money on if they weren't motivated by those profound ideological issues. So these values are the heart of ideologies that drive people, whether it's political ideologies or religious ideologies or scientific ideologies or any other ideologies, that push people to go great guns in their life, to do profound things. And Lyotard means this as in a kind of a secular notion of profound values. So even though he's using the word polytheism, he doesn't really mean it in the mystical spiritual sense, more in the kind of secular driving force sense. But is that so very far removed from what actual polytheists of thousands of years ago and to this very day mean when they are talking of gods and goddesses, of these vast forces that drive us, and not only humans, maybe many other species too, to make things happen in the world that flow through? And so the driving forces that are at the heart of Athena are different from those that are at the heart of Aphrodite or at the heart of Hecate. And so those people who are worshipping, engaging with whatever way you want to phrase it, with one particular deity today, and obviously as polytheists you can chop and change between, but the focus of a ritual to Athena is different to the focus to a ritual to Aphrodite. Now, in a monotheist culture or a monoculture, because we could be talking at a secular level here, kind of like a China or Russia, a secular monoculture, there is one set of values. In a monotheist religion, there is one God. And therefore, everything boils down to the one. And the reason Lyotard talks about polytheism in this sense, even though he doesn't really mean Zeus and Jupiter and Hera and Cernunnos and so forth, is that many cultures, perhaps the majority of cultures around the world, don't have one driving force. They have sets of driving forces, like pantheons of gods. And just as with actual polytheists, you don't only worship one god or only worship one goddess. On Monday you go to this temple, on Tuesday you go to that temple, and on Wednesday you go to another one. So you're moving between deities because you accept this whole pantheon exists. And even if on Monday you're focusing on one deity from the pantheon, on Tuesday it'll be another, on Wednesday another. So you're open to the whole pantheon. So most of us are open to, from Lyotard's perspective, multiple sets of values. So what we can't, in other words, bring down our motivation to one thing. It's multiple things. And this sometimes makes life incredibly confusing, particularly when values clash with each other. And maybe we can understand mythologies about gods and goddesses going to war with one another and feuding with one another as, what do these stories mean? Is it a way of describing how the forces clash, that not everything works in harmony with each other all of the time? Maybe in some big grand scale picture it does, but at a more kind of lived human level, often forces clash. What's good for one is not good for the other, and vice versa. There's an interesting analogy made within care ethics about the idea that, oh, I love all life. Well, that's nice to. If you love the hare, sorry, not that hare, but that hare. If you love the hare, you protect it from the fox. If you love the fox, you feed the hare to it. So if you love all life, you love the hare and the fox equally. What the fuck do you do? Because what's good for the one ain't good for the other. Either the fox starves and the hare is happy, or the hare gets eaten and the fox is happy. So there is no, within this kind of grand scale of values, it's not always easy to keep everyone happy. That's what's good for one will not be good for another in the short term or in the small scale. And the big picture, well, that's why we're mortals, not gods, because we're not so good at the big picture, and we'll leave the big picture to the gods because they've got consciousness big enough for it. We don't. How do we reconcile these different values, different conflicts, different perceptions, different notions? And is there, this isn't something Lyotard goes down the line of arguing, but it's something I'm going to go down the line of arguing, in a monoculture, is there a danger of monomania, of becoming kind of obsessed with, so obsessed with one point of view, you are not capable of appreciating life from any other point of view, and it becomes destructive and unhealthy. Now, I'm not saying people in monotheist religions go down this line, but people with a monomaniacal view of life. So you could have someone who is a real hardline Marxist, atheist, doesn't believe in any religion at all, and for whom all life, every act, every word, every deed, every flaming thing you can think of, boils down to conflict theory between the haves and the have-nots, between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, between the plebs and the patricians. Everything is that. Everything is that. They cannot appreciate anything from any point of view other than that. Art, music, drama, romance, love, dinner time. I mean, you think of it, it's all boiled down to this lowest common denominator of conflict theory. Just as for some people, absolutely every sodden thing in existence boils down to gender conflict between men and women, or boils down to whatever their obsession du jour is, and they can't think from other points of view. And so partly what Lyotard is saying, and what I'm saying, is that the capacity to worship at different altars on different days is not only about that sort of spiritual contact, which is what I'm saying, not what Lyotard is, but is also what you give attention to, but is also your set of values, and is also how you are perceiving the world through that lens. So it's like, I suppose, having glasses where you can change the colour of the lens. So today I'm going to see the world through a yellow lens, and tomorrow I'll see the world through a green lens, and the day after through a purple lens. And so you have all of these lenses that can go in and out. And the world is as a complex array of all of them, except the nature of human experience and our capacity to process time. We kind of live in the moment. So you do one today and another tomorrow and another the day after. So it's very difficult to do everything simultaneously. It's a bit confusing. So we tend to do things in turns, as it were. But the monomaniac can only do one, and denies the validity of anything else except the one. Their view is the only view. And so they are oblivious to the existence of any other lens, oblivious to the existence of any other altar. And so when you are before the altar of Odin, you see the world through the lens of Odin, through the eyes of Odin. When you are before the altar of Freya, you see the world through the lens of Freya, how she thinks, how she is, how the act of communion with Freya, your mind starts to align with her view of the world, at least for a period of time, and then a different day it's a different deity. So you flow between these experiences, and each one not only has their own views, their own values, their own experiences, but their own epistemology. So it's epistemology in the sense not only knowing whether they exist in the first place and so forth, how you establish the reality of these claims. When someone says, oh, I had a mystical vision of wet wet, and well, how do we know this to be the case? Not only that sort of epistemology, but each one's approach to what is worth thinking about. So just as going back to that St. Thomas quote, you could say, well, the sensation conscious mind takes knowledge in through the means of sensation, and the thinker takes it in through the means of thinking, and the feeler through the means of feeling. So we could expand way, way, way beyond those four to say, actually, well, if there's 1,000 gods, there's 1,000 ways of thinking. There's 1,000 lenses through which to take information in and to know which information is worth paying attention to and which is not. To in one mode of consciousness, you evaluate the truth of the world through this method, and in a different consciousness you evaluate it through that method. And a key point here which I'm trying to get at is that whilst some people might see this as kind of nightmarish and conflicting and too messy for words, the capacity to move through these differences is contingent on pluralism. The notion that there is no one road to the top of the mountain, but many different roads. Some might take you a bloody sight longer to get to the top of the mountain than others do. They take the scenic route, and others might be a bit more direct, but there's all sorts of routes to the top of the mountain. And everyone has an element of truth. And so you get the notion, as in Jainism, of a Nakanta Vada, which is the story of or at least it's the philosophical concept behind the story of the blind men and the elephant, where the bunch of blind men bump into an elephant. One of them thinks it's a bird because they've got hold of the ear and they think it's a wing, and the other thinks it's a snake because they've got hold of the trunk, and the other one thinks it's a pillar of a temple, a big stone pillar, because they've got hold of the elephant's leg. And they're all kind of right in that they're all describing what they're experiencing, but they're all kind of wrong because they're not putting all of these experiences together to get the big picture. And so the bedrock of that philosophical concept in Jainism is part of that Vedic pluralist approach to life, something we are sadly lacking in the West, of Nakanta Vada, is that we are all like blind men or blind women, blind whatever, and we've all got hold of this creature. We're all fiddling with a little bit of it that we've got hold of, that little bit there. And I think it's this, and you think it's that, and that woman over there thinks it's something else, and we all think it's something, and we are each describing what we've got. So we're telling the truth about what we experience, but we're not putting it all together to realise that the totality of the cosmos is the biggest frigging elephant you could possibly imagine. Way, 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 way bigger than anything we are capable of conceiving. So it's not that I should go and set light to you because you think it's this, that you think it's a snake and I think it's a bird's wing. It's, your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth, but we're both wrong at the same time, because all we're seeing is our own little bit of it. And whilst we can be true to our own description of what we're experiencing, we need to keep it in the back of our minds that we have sorely limited experiences. And the actual big picture is so trippy and big that we can't get hold of it. And so whilst I'm talking about being a polytheist, I'm using that term because that little bit of reality that I've got hold of feels polytheist. Somebody else will have hold of a little bit that feels monotheist, or a little bit that feels atheist, or whatever ist you want to go for. And we're all kind of describing what we're feeling, unaware that the big picture is just too trippy for words. And there are no words for it. The human language lacks terms to describe anything that colossal and complex and incomprehensible. That's why we come up with words like God or goddess. They're big words that don't mean a lot, really. You think about that. It's as close as we get to saying the favourite word of good omens, the book of ineffable. It's ineffable. Oh, it's all far too much, as Aziraphale keeps telling us. You won't understand it, so don't try, love. or better yet, do try, but accept that you'll just get a headache and you won't really get the big picture. But it doesn't hurt to have a little think about it. But just it's all too big, too huge, too vast. And so when we're thinking about these vast array of beings, these are all reflections, aspects, bits of this cosmological elephant that we're touching upon. So the person who touches upon Aphrodite, and the other person who touches upon Frigga, and the other person who touches upon Toilette, and somebody else who touches upon Christ, and somebody else who touches upon whatever, are all feeling a little bit of something and describing what they're feeling. And so the importance of pluralism is that you acknowledge that other people are not mad, are not stupid. Well, some of them may be mad and some of them may be stupid, but merely because they touch on something different from you cannot be dismissed by saying, oh, you're mad, you're stupid, you're deluded, the devil has tricked you. Is not that simplistic, that your truth is it and everyone else is a whack job. Rather to say that we've all got a little bit of something, and we may not always describe what we've got hold of terribly well or in very clear terms, even to ourselves, let alone when we're attempting to describe the ineffable to anybody else, which you can't actually do because it's ineffable. But we're doing our best to say, well, it feels like this. There are some people, of course, who would say that very notion of it being ineffable is wrong, and that if you apply the scientific method, it all becomes effable eventually. Which is an act of profound faith in the capacities of science to explain everything eventually, and the capacity of the human mind to get and comprehend and carry out science to that level of expertise. As much as I admire scientists, I'm not sure that even if we exist for another 1,000,000 years, I don't think humanity will ever be that clever to explain everything, because everything is just too much to comprehend and take in. But it's that trying to think about how we think about how we comprehend and look at these pictures and concepts and ideas, and to have a sense of, I suppose what I'm arguing fundamentally is that a bedrock of epistemology in polytheism is pluralism, to say that there are lots of ways of assessing truth, lots of ways of assessing reality and testing claims, and that all of these ways have to be allowed for and taken into account, and we have to consider that the ways of assessing certain claims will be relevant for those types of claims, but not necessarily relevant for other types of claims. So the kinds of tests you'd want to carry out to find out if a new medication really does cure a disease would be very different from the kinds of procedures you'd want to carry out to find if this person who has just declared undying love to you really does love you. Different claims have different modes of testing, modes of validating, modes of finding out how they can be weighed and assessed. It's a big issue. I was going to touch a little on Alston's theology, who was trying to deal with the difficulty. Well, I'll see if I can do this in 5 minutes and then stop talking, because I can record other stuff on a different occasion. William Alston's Christian theologian, who said that the means of assessing truth claims made about Christ and God and angels and various other concepts within Christianity can feel the same as the sorts of means of testing concepts within Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and Islam and so on. But of course, if you have an exclusivist religion that says we're the only real religion and them other lot, they're all just a bit mad and making it up as they go along, then you're in a double bind where the means of putting to test your own faith are pretty much the same as the means of those other peculiar people putting to test their faiths. Therefore, you end up locked in this double bind situation where you want to disprove their faith and prove your faith, and actually it's the same technique in both occasions, and you just kind of tie yourself in knots, which is, I can understand, a problem for somebody like Alston who has an exclusivist religion. But where you don't have an exclusivist religion or philosophy, where you have a pluralist one that says this, there are lots of gods and lots of this and lots of that and lots of the other, and yeah, I've never experienced the goddess Juno, but I'm perfectly ready to accept that you have, and that the methods you have for testing that your visions of the goddess Juno are valid are probably quite similar to the methods I have of testing that the god Lu is real and valid, and we can both be right, because your truth does not preclude my truth, and vice versa. Because within pluralism, lots of things can be true, rather than only the one thing that can be true. And I think that has to be factored in for a lot of ideas within polytheism. I'm not saying this is true of any of legal truths and scientific truths and so on, but with polytheist truths within the realm of polytheist religions, that we have to allow that there's all these multiple ways of evaluating and assessing our own experiences and those of followers, devotees within different types of polytheism who have experiences of different arrays of entities and the various claims that can be made about them and made a sort of beings slightly smaller scale. And people sometimes claim like the healing powers or the visionary powers or whatever. Those claims can also be evaluated and assessed, but each in different ways. It's not a case of one size of epistemology, one size of truth evaluation fits everything, but rather we have to approach different things in different ways and be open to that pluralism and try to promote a sort of tolerance of other ways of being and other ways of thinking. That said, I think that we also have to, you'll joke about having your mind is so open, your brain fell out. It's a bit of a risk that in trying to be very open, sometimes you can be open to things that are actually quite dangerous, and claims that can be quite dangerous if they are not considered in a sensible light. But I think that's maybe an issue for another day. And we got quite well to the well over an hour now, so I'll stop wittering for now and think more about this on a different occasion. Particularly if anyone's got any questions, that would be useful. If you chuck in a few questions, that will help me shape answers and rather than just waffling endlessly, kind of focus in on things that are actually useful for people to think about, to consider, because I'm trying not just to witter to myself, but witter to other people. Okay, thank you.